Ukraine at this crucial moment for the security and peace, not just for Ukraine, but for the whole of Europe. So I would just describe the mood in Kyiv and what the Ukrainian authorities and the public is saying, because I'm not just a non-resident fellow at SIPA, I'm also a journalist, and I've been working as a journalist for the last 16 years, writing for Ukrainian and international media. And actually I was late a little bit today because I had a deadline, I had to submit another article. What can I say about the perception here in Kyiv? Well, the Ukrainian authorities, especially in recent days, they've been making multiple statements trying to calm the public down, because there were signals coming in that are very worrying and are contributing to an increasing anxiety here in Ukraine. Signals about mounting Russian presence on Ukraine's borders, about Russian troops now on the territory of Belarus, just several hundred kilometers from the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. And of course, the decision of several Western embassies, including the UK embassy, to withdraw part of its family members of its staff from Kyiv, it also contributed to a feeling of anxiety and worry in Ukraine, among Ukrainians. So what the Ukrainian government has been doing in recent days was trying to calm people down by saying that there is no risk of an imminent Russian invasion, that if an attack, a large-scale attack happens, it will not be earlier than in several weeks, because now the numbers of troops stationed at Russian borders do not indicate there is a risk of an invasion in the next days. Also, there was an editorial published yesterday on one of major Ukrainian media, Ukrainska Pravda, penned by former Defense Minister Andriy Zagorodnyuk and other defense experts, who argued that there are no signs, those imminent signs of an imminent invasion that could happen like today or tomorrow or in the next days. And those signs would be stationing of Russian field hospitals and several other indicators that they still do not see. So according to Ukrainian observers and the Ukrainian government, they say there is no risk of an invasion in the next days, but it is possible that it might happen over the next several weeks. So they do not exclude this possibility. And about the public mood, well, in general, there is no panic. People are not, in the majority of them, they are not packing their bags. They are not leaving their houses. They are resilient and they are resolved to stay and to defend Ukraine in what way they can.
Thank you. James, what would be your opinion on that?
I think the risk of all-out war against Ukraine are considerable. I agree with Olga and with my friend Andrei Zagorodnyuk, the former defense minister, that it is not an imminent risk. It is certainly not going to happen until the Beijing Olympics conclude, in my view. But let's understand why. We had the Minsk Accord 7 years ago. The Russians have been trying all other means, very unpleasant means, since then to destabilize Ukraine, since his election, to manipulate and intimidate President Zelensky, to pressure Germany and France in particular to force Ukraine to concede Russia's fundamental demands, which have been on the table at least since 2014, I would argue far earlier, and all of this has reached a dead end. And that led to a decision, the end of last year, to force the issue, which became clear in January last year when Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, presented what he called an ultimatum publicly to Germany and France to either make its wards, as he called them, in Ukraine behave and fall into line and comply with Russia's demands, or Russia would do it itself. And everything we have seen since then has followed from that. I think that for a variety of reasons, it would be very difficult and damaging for Russia and for Putin's own standing within the elite to back down. I think until recently, they fully expected that the mounting pressure, the ultimata they have presented, would create real fissures inside the West, play upon divisions which always exist in any American administration, and begin to produce some form of compliance with the essence of their demands. And that is not happening. Even in the past several weeks and days, there has been a marked toughening of our response. And so, the Russians have put themselves in a trap, and it is hard to see how this can resolve itself without enormous damage. So again, I come back to my answer. I think the risks are now considerable.
Just quickly, you both said that high risk, but it doesn't look like invasion is going to happen tomorrow. Just a straight yes, no, highly unlikely. Do you think in the next 3 months we'll see Russia invade Ukraine? And James, just come back to you on that, please.
It is still in the balance, because if we can do what we have not yet done, which is persuade the Russians that the consequences will be ruinous, and that on our part would depend upon military steps and not simply economic and financial steps, I think it will not happen. But the odds in the next the odds remain very high. And if you go beyond February, the logistical challenges of mounting a considerable and devastating attack become progressively less favorable to Russia. So next month is going to be the point of maximum danger, in my view.
Is that the same view you share, Olga?
Yes, I tend to agree with James on this. I think it's still in the balance. The likelihood is very high, but there is still room to change the Putin's calculation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Richard, did you want to come in here?
A very quick one, if I may. To you both, James first. From what I'm reading, it all depends very much on the ground and the ability of tanks to move fast. That ability is granted if the ground is frozen, which I understand it is now. And of course, in the spring, it gets all boggy and muddy and makes manoeuvre far harder. I take it that is going to be a major factor in Putin's decision to come or to invade or not.
There are other factors. The Russians have not mounted an operation on this scale, combined arms warfare, anything like it, since the assault on Berlin in 1945. This is a formidable undertaking, coordinating airborne forces, amphibious forces, ground forces, aircraft, combat helicopters, all the rest of it. This is a formidable undertaking, and achieving very quick results with a country that I think we underestimate this in the West, a country that has demonstrated extraordinary resilience, which has the ability to be defeated and reconstitute itself. And add to that equation that apart from those serving in the Ukrainian armed forces and deployed now, we have a very large number of recent veterans of the Donbass conflicts over the past several years, who are hardened, experienced professional people, and of course know their own ground, know their own country, know their own conditions. So I absolutely do not share the view of a number of admittedly well-credentialed Western experts who believe that if the Russians use devastating force, this is all going to be over in a matter of hours or a couple of days. And I think there are elements inside the general staff of the Russian armed forces who share my view that this is more difficult than it looks.
Okay, a couple of interests. Gavin, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you very much, James, particularly to you, if you don't mind. There was some considerable commentary over the weekend suggesting that this is all a large geopolitical bluff, that Russia has aspirations to be treated seriously once again, and getting President Biden to meet in Geneva, for example, shows that they are a player worth talking to, that they have aspirations in curtailing the support Ukraine has, but they have no intention of mounting a military campaign. You suggested in your initial response that they are now in somewhat of a trap, as if their geopolitical bluff is not working. So I suppose my question then is, rather than the danger of full-blown war within the next 2 or 3 months, what's the danger that it occurs accidentally?
I don't put a high risk on that. I certainly don't think, contrary to a lot of what we hear and a lot of this disinformation, that Ukrainians and Ukrainian radicals in some ways are going to provoke a response from Russia. The Russians are trying to engineer this, trying to engineer regime change. They've been doing this for a while. They don't understand Ukraine. This has not been happening. So I don't see Ukraine providing the sort of pretext that would enable them to do it. And the pretext that they might fabricate will be very transparent, I think, to everybody else. Like all dangerous aggressors, Russia would far rather that we capitulate, all of us capitulate to its demands without fighting. But they have always accepted the reality of war. They are prepared for it. And I don't think that they are in principle afraid of it or rule it out. What affects it is their assessment of the correlation of forces at the time, all of them, economic, military, and the psychological morale factor in the West as a whole. Cohesion, unity, all these things get factored together, and the estimation of likely consequences. They expect more inconvenience and all the rest of it before they make this decision. Sorry for a long answer.
Okay. Lots of interest in this question. We've got two more. If we can keep them quite short, we need to make progress. Sarah first and then Kevin.
Thanks. James, you seem to suggest that if Russia were faced with a military opposition, they may back down. Is that what you were saying? And if you were, what would you suggest that scope of military opposition be?
I think Ukraine's own capacity to deter what we fear is greater than advertised, greater than we appreciate. The fact it's not been played up enough, I unfortunately didn't hear any reference to it in the parliamentary discussion we just had. The fact that a number of people in Washington and elsewhere have gone on record saying anything like this occurs, there will be a fundamental reassessment of our force levels in the eastern flanks of NATO. This has quite an effect. To say to the Russians, you've accused us of all sorts of nonsensical threats we're not posing, but be in no doubt, if you give us a reason to pose them, then we will. This has an effect if we're doing it. The fact that there is already discussion and some plans afoot to transfer troops, the fact that now weapons deliveries are taking place at an accelerated pace. All these things matter. Of course, I think much of this should have been done back in March, but better late than never, and it's starting to register. So all this in combination has and can continue to have an impact, even if the Russians, as I suspect, remain very skeptical as to whether we are going to go forward with these types of sanctions that we're discussing, and as to whether they can endure them or not.
Okay.
Sorry, if I might just add to James' answers to previous questions. So as for the question about the weather conditions and whether it plays a role, whether it's winter or spring, well, according to many military experts, it might not play such a big role after all, because it is not a given that Russia would focus on the land invasion. Because Ukrainian capacity to defend and to oppose Russian land invasion is now much larger than it used to be, with all the Javelin anti-tank missiles, with also the delivery of the UK aid last week, other anti-tank weapons. So it's not a given that Russia will focus on a land invasion, and if it doesn't, and if it actually focuses more on air and missile strikes, that could be an option, and that could be a real danger. So and it doesn't depend on weather conditions. So that's one point I wanted to make. Another, if I may, sorry, another point, if I may, about the probability of Ukrainians being provoked into something. Well, this is what Russia really would like to see, and they are actually trying like all they can, and this narrative has been also pushed by Russian disinformation for a long time and by Russian officials as well. But Ukrainian authorities and military, they show incredible restraint, so it's very unlikely something like that is going to happen, and and they could be provoked. And for the last questions, like what kind of deterrence, military deterrent there could be, military response. Well, the article I was just submitting today was about this latest military assistance delivered to Ukraine from the UK, from the US, also the promise of the Baltic states and the Czech Republic. So all this is a very strong deterrent to a possible new Russian attack, because on the one hand, it boosts Ukraine military and society morale. It gives Ukrainians a feeling that they are not alone, that they have not been abandoned by their Western partners, and there is a concrete assistance coming in, not just words, but deeds. And as you probably know, the God Save the Queen was trending on Ukrainian social media last week after the UK sent the military assistance. So this is one thing. And also in Russian eyes, we are seeing hysterical messages from the Kremlin in reaction to this military assistance. And this indicates that Russia really doesn't want it to happen. It doesn't want the Western weapons coming to Ukraine, and it could serve as a really strong deterrent. The problem, as I said before, is just that most of these weapons are focused on Russian land hardware, but Ukraine's crucial weaknesses and vulnerabilities are air and missile defense, and that's what military experts tell me, so it's coming from credible sources.
Okay, thank you, Olga. Kevin, quickly on this one.
Yeah, James, can I just ask, you raised the issue around concern within the Russian military about the scope of an invasion of Ukraine. Could I just ask your opinion in terms of what public opinion would be? Because clearly in Afghanistan and Chechnya, they became very unpopular in terms of body bags going home. Have you got any insight into what the current thinking is there?
The only, when it comes to ordinary Russians, the only thing that the Russian elite and establishment fears at this point is it's not internal privation, it's not inconvenience, it's not all this other anything else. It is a major overseas venture like this that fails. Every regime change in Russia has occurred after a surprising defeat in an external war. And they're aware of this. Nothing could be more damaging to Russia's prestige, its position in the region, in Europe, in the world, to the Putin regime and to Putin personally, than to start a war and fail to achieve objectives. And they're aware of that. But there's another thing they're aware of, and let's remember, the authority in Russia, Putin's own authority, depends upon respect. What he is conscious of and has to be conscious of is the trust and respect of the Russian elite and all the establishments that constitute a very large body of people to have invested all of this into not only resubordinating Ukraine to Russia, but damaging, undermining the whole system of European and transatlantic security. And to fail, and to let it fail, poses real risk to his own position in these establishments. So he is under pressure, I think, from two directions.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Kevin. Can I just lead on for that very quickly to ask about options for Russia on how far an invasion might go? Because there's suggestions here in the UK that the Luhansk Donetsk area would be easy to take over. Essentially, they've got proxy forces there already, so Putin could say, look, I've defied NATO, I've invaded, look strong back home. Option 2 would be more towards the Dnieper River, linking up the land corridor with Crimea. Option 3, potentially, very bold move, taking over the entire country. Firstly, is those, I know they're very crude, but rough assessments as to what options there might be, and then the possibilities of them actually taking place. Olga, do you want to quickly go first?
Well, I think James would be better positioned to answer this.
Okay, Thank you, James.
A low-risk objective for Russia is to occupy and force what they already occupy, which is the Donetsk and Luhansk republics.
Yeah.
That will change the military equation and possibly the political equation too in very damaging ways for Ukraine without occupying new territory. And it wouldn't be opposed by Ukrainian armed forces. And going along with it, if they can pressure Lukashenko into conceding it, the establishment of a permanent or long-term group of forces in Belarus, not only would that, again, be extremely damaging to Ukraine as a factor you have to consider and prepare for in resource and budgets, but it would change the security equation overnight in the Baltic states and Poland. I mean, don't forget Poland, Latvia, Lithuania have common borders with Belarus. So even the requirements of a NATO tripwire deterrent would have to be considerably, again, revisited, ramped up. So that's one possibility. What Olga talked about earlier is, of course, highly possible and very appealing. Minimal ground forces involvement, but mainly not just aerial activity. Don't forget Ukraine's vulnerable infrastructure, its whole energy infrastructure, targeting all of this. Enormous damage to the economy, the energy system, the electricity grid, all of these things they could do. Infrastructure war, very damaging, very menacing, with incalculable consequences. But the question they have to ask themselves is, supposing we do all of this and it fails, supposing Ukraine comes out of this tougher, more determined, more consolidated than it has ever been, supposing this galvanizes the West into rethinking its whole level of defense commitment, the US rethinking the whole level of its defense commitment in Europe, does that leave Russia better off? I am sure these questions are being discussed.
Okay.
Let me just add to this. I'm sorry. Yeah. So I think there might be multiple fronts where Russia can attack, and it might be done also to disperse Ukrainian forces, so like they distract their attention, so they are not like cannot just go in one direction. So there might be attacks on multiple fronts using multiple types of forces, and that could be also combined with so-called like hybrid attacks, with cyber attacks. And we've seen already indications, we've seen what looked like a minor cyber attack, but it is possible that some malware was inserted during that attack that could be activated at a later stage. And actually today's blackouts in the Central Asian republics, they have been like also seen as warning signal in Ukraine, because it's unclear what the reasons are, and there are fears that there could be like also the blackouts and the connection could be cut off, electricity supplies, and cyber attacks that would disrupt the functioning of various Ukrainian sectors of economy and everything. So Russia has multiple options. It also has its agents on the ground working undercover and waiting to get into action once the situation arises. So I think it's also important to expose those agents, such as Murayev with the recent Foreign Office statement. An attack can occur on multiple fronts, and we should be prepared for that.
And is it fair to say the further west that you go, the harder it will be to retain, to hold the ground, because there would likely be an insurgency to Russia to maintain their forces there to keep the peace?
Yes, that's what is often said, but also the resistance in the eastern Ukraine shouldn't be underestimated, because in Kharkiv, actually, in 2014, I spoke to people from Kharkiv yesterday, and they said, well, if the army was able to defend Ukraine in 2014 when they were fighting in their sleepers, now the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian armed forces in a much better shape and are much stronger. And as James previously said, there are so many people like the veterans who have experience of combat. Now the territorial defense units are being formed, and people are joining from all social strata and from all ages. So I think the insurgency will not only be limited to Western Ukraine or Central Ukraine, but we can expect also strong insurgency in the Eastern Ukraine, in those areas that Russia considers that would be easy to capture.
Thank you for that. Before I turn to Richard to take us forward with the next question, could I just ask you, James, you mentioned Beijing, and I'm just really curious as to why I'm surprised that an attack hasn't taken place, given where we are, it's all set, ready to go. But you mentioned Beijing, and I'm just wondering whether President Xi got on the telephone to Putin and said, like what you're doing out there, amazing stuff, keeping the West busy. We've got something similar going on with Taiwan, so we're watching really with interest. But do you mind just holding back? International attention will be on the Beijing Olympic Games. Do you mind waiting until that's finished? Is that a potential conversation that might have taken place?
Well, the Chinese have already come out officially and backed Russia's demands to the West. So there's no question Russia has the full diplomatic support of China. There's also no question that Russia already, to a considerable degree, relies upon China as a major compensating factor to the effectiveness of Western economic sanctions. Now, I think we should be in no doubt. If we fail to rise to the challenge in Ukraine and follow through with steps we are beginning to take, our prestige, our reputation in China will be greatly diminished. And so there could be no greater fallacy than to say, well, we must let Ukraine go because China is the big adversary and we must concentrate there. We will be in a far weaker position to do that. May I just also reinforce Olga's point? The Russians want to destroy Ukraine's combat forces. They don't want to be in a position where they have to occupy ground, where they have to deal with civilians, where they have to deal with an insurgency, where they have to deal with Ukrainian special forces and sabotage and all the rest of it, and they dread getting bogged down in a long war. They want this to be devastating, conclusive, and short.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's now turn from the operational side of things as to why it's all happening, or why it might be happening anyway, what Russia's up to. Richard.
James, I think to a certain extent, your last answer answered in part the question I'm about to ask you. But what does Russia hope to gain from its latest military build-up on Ukraine's borders? And how is it different from the build-up in the spring of 2021, which I believe was a matter of weeks and much of the hardware was left behind, obviously for the troops to come back and occupy at a later date?
I think what happened in 2021,
yeah.
2021 is what the Russian military would call a reconnaissance, an effort to assess the mettle, the capacity, the awareness of Ukraine and the West, and factor the Biden-Putin meetings in all of that and everything they've seen. In fact, I have to say, the withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan, the way that happened, all of these things to get an assessment of just who they're dealing with, what kind of opposition we have. And I think that their conclusion, whether it was right or wrong, is that the West is very weak and we can afford to continue pushing them. And that's in large part why we are where we are. And the fact that we're now pushing back, as I have to reiterate, I think we're beginning to show signs of pushing back effectively. I think this has come as something of a surprise to them. So there's nothing new in the fact. This has been going on from the beginning, from the day Ukraine became formally independent, from the day the Cold War officially ended, that Russia, as Putin puts it, wants Ukraine to define its independence in cooperation with Russia, to subordinate itself to Russia, and to make that the condition for what we would call independence. Of course, there's no independence at all there. And the Russians have not made it secret. They want a new security order in Europe based upon what I think the Prime Minister recently referred to as Yalta principles. an hour ago. These are very old, these are very old objectives. And they're at a point where they feel if there's going to be a war, this is where they were at least a couple of weeks ago, there is no better time for it than now. The longer we wait, the worse things get. The reality politically has been slipping away from us. Everything we have tried to do by other means has run up against a dead end. I'm pleased to see Olga nodding, but that's why I think we're here.
Thank you, Jane. Olga, can I ask you the same question? What's Russia trying to gain? That was the first part of my question. And what's different about spring 2021?
Yeah, so in general, I agree with what James said. I just want to elaborate on something. So I agree that for now, for Russia, it's now a now or never moment, that it feels that now the momentum has grown to solve the Ukrainian question as they themselves frame it. And I also agree with the point that Russia has lost other types of leverage over Ukraine, especially since 2014, since it started the war in Ukraine. The attitudes towards Russia and towards, conversely, Ukraine's integration with the European Union and NATO has changed significantly and shifted in the other direction. So if before the war, a significant part of Ukrainian population wanted to have partner relations with Russia, now it's a tiny minority, it's about 10%. Instead, about 60% of Ukrainians now, according to polls, support integration of Ukraine into European Union and NATO. That support, especially for NATO, it was just at about 20, not more than 30% prior to Russian aggression in Ukraine. So Russia has achieved the opposite of what it actually wants to in Ukraine by launching the war. So it failed on this front. Also, Russian attempts to have a political influence in Ukraine are also failing. Pro-Russian politicians lost a huge amount of support they enjoyed before the war. So now pro-Russian politicians poll at about 5 to 10%. And that's a huge difference from the previous levels of support. And the pro-Russian President Yanukovych was elected in 2010. So it's impossible to imagine in today's Ukraine that a pro-Russian politician is elected as a president or occupies a high position in the government.
Olga, can I quickly interrupt you? So the more they fail, logically, the more likely invasion is.
The more they fail, the more they, with other means, the more Russia sees a military force and coercion by force as the only solution to bring Ukraine back and to subjugate Ukraine and to bring it back into Russia's orbit. But I think this is also doomed to fail because Russia really has, and Putin's regime and Putin and the Kremlin, they fail to understand the amount of change that has been going on in Ukraine since 2014 and the transformation in the civil society, in the conscience of people, in the democratic institutions that are becoming stronger with every passing day. So I think Russia underestimates Ukraine very much, and that's why it's undertaking these aggressive steps. And also, if and when it comes to an invasion, there would be a question of motivation of Ukrainian soldiers versus Russian soldiers. Ukrainian soldiers will be highly motivated to defend their land, and I'm hearing voices, and I'm speaking to people in eastern Ukraine, in southern Ukraine, who say we have nowhere to go, that we will not give up our land. There are more than 1.5 million internally displaced people who had to flee from the occupied Crimea, from occupied Donetsk and Luhansk regions to other parts of Ukraine, and they don't want to flee again. And they are willing to protect their new homes. So I think Russia underestimates this resolve very much.
Olga, thank you very much, Dida. I'm going to hand back to the chairman. Thank you.
So just to conclude that important piece, would it be fair to say that without Russian interference, Ukraine would eventually join NATO and or the EU over the next couple of decades or so, and Russia really needs a buffer zone? It really does not want either of these two organizations rubbing up against it, and therefore it's useful for Russia to have that that bit of land that sort of breaks the two. Olga.
Yeah, well, I think like the main Putin's motivation is not as much to restore Russian empire or to, create buffer zones. His main goal is to cling to power, to stay in power, and to preserve his kleptocratic regime. Okay. And he sees the democratic states at its borders, as Ukraine, as an existential threat to this goal, because multiple revolutions in Ukraine led to the government change. Okay. And Ukraine has freedom of assembly, Ukraine has free media, Ukraine has opposition, Ukraine has free elections, all these things that are absent in Putin's Russia and that represent an existential threat to Putin's regime. So I think his main logic, he's acting out of this logic and bringing back USSR or restoring Russian empire is just a useful narrative, to sell this to also to Russian population in order to try to gain some popular support.
Okay, thank you for that, Olga. Very comprehensive. Sarah, to you.
Thanks. Olga, you mentioned at the very first question about the mood of the Ukrainian people, and it's stoic and it's keep calm and carry on. But how did the extensive cyber attacks and bomb threats affect their outlook? And then what about regions like the Donbass, where there are mixed loyalties and some subversive tactics going on? What is the mood like there?
Yeah, thank you for this question. In fact, the cyber attacks and the bomb threats are nothing new for Ukraine, because these things and these threats have been present here for years. You might remember major cyber attacks in 2017 that disrupted an operation of various Ukrainian governmental and non-governmental services and also had reverberations around the globe. So these, unfortunately, are not something new, and the same applies to the bomb threats. Now we see an increase of these alerts, and according to Ukrainian security services, they are being coordinated by Russian intelligence via social media such as Telegram. So there are more these threats, and of course, it irritates people. But I think actually the main emotion and the main feeling that I myself have, and I see among Ukrainians, is not that of fear, but of anger. It makes Ukrainians very angry because we just want to continue with our normal lives. We see that our country is changing, it's developing, it's actually becoming a better place to live with every passing year, despite of war and despite of all Russian attempts to destabilize it. I myself, I studied abroad, and I made a conscious decision to go back and live in Ukraine and to work for the development of this country, and I never regret it. And I actually see these changes. So Ukraine is changing. This irritates Putin, but we seeing these Russian attempts to prevent our development feel a lot of anger, and this anger, it can have also a constructive way. We are now directing it into strengthening our resilience. And as for your question about the loyalties in the eastern Ukraine and in Donbass, well, of course, there are a lot of people, mostly elderly people, because especially those who stayed in the areas that are close to the contact line are elderly people that decided they had nowhere to go, and they didn't have an option to move and start a life anew in other parts of Ukraine. So loyalties of those people can still be with Russia, or rather with what they see, with USSR. They might think that there is a possibility of return to the times of nostalgia. They are nostalgic, and they might have these loyalties out of pure nostalgia. But from what I gather when I speak to people in those areas, that the most proactive people there are all pro-Ukrainian. So those who support Russia, they are usually a passive minority, but those who support Ukraine are an active majority.
Thank you. James, do you have anything to add?
May I just reiterate a key point that Olga made earlier, which is fundamental, which is lost. Before Crimea, before Russia detached parts of Ukraine, support for NATO membership in Ukraine never exceeded 30%. It was normally about 25% or 30%. We have not been able to penetrate Russian thinking to the point where they understand the only thing that creates this hypothetical NATO threat is you. The only thing that makes Ukrainians anti-Russian is you. After Crimea, I was having dinner in Kiev with a very senior member of their defense establishment who's very pro-NATO. And he burst into tears. He said, with everything going on, I always thought of them as a kindred people. I never thought they would do this. So, one should not underestimate this. Russia has caused all the problems it fears. Russia has created all the threats that it has. And we've not been able to get through to them. We're dealing with an elite of people, a whole class of people who are historically, psychologically, temperamentally unable to accept the reality of Ukraine as a different people, a different place, a place of its own, a land of its own. That's, been the basic problem.
Okay, thank you. Thanks both, Chair.
If I may just add, I just wanted to touch upon the issue of, a Russian-speaking population, which is sometimes confused with loyalty to Russia. In fact, a lot of Russian-speaking people are in Ukrainian armed forces and are fighting against Russian aggression. A huge majority of Russian-speaking population in Ukraine does not want to see Russia in Ukraine, does not want to, have any connection to Russia. So it absolutely doesn't define loyalties, and this is sometimes lost, I think, as I see from the media representation of the situation and from the debate in Ukraine.
Thanks.
Thank you. Derek.
Thanks, Chair. I'm not sure whether this is David or Olga. Maybe Olga first, but do you know, have you got any view about whether the Russian military leadership and the Kremlin, Putin, are absolutely on the same plan, that they are completely at one about what should happen over Ukraine? You mentioned before, James, that there was some concern, and also you talked about the establishment. So have you got any intelligence that there's any divide at all between the Russian military leadership and Putin and the Kremlin? Olga, we'll start with Olga, I think, first.
Okay, well, I don't have intelligence, but I think, and it is plausible, and there are indications that there is no unanimity in the Russian leadership over a potential invasion of Ukraine. But, as we know, the ultimate decision is up to one man, and if he decides to invade, other people will just stay quiet. I think what we should focus on, and what the Western countries and the UK should focus on, is Putin's inner circle are extremely rich people with strong connections to the West, who send their children to study in Western universities, who have their wealth and who store their wealth in Western banks, and who buy expensive property in Switzerland and in the UK, in Italy, in other countries. So, and I think those people might be really reluctant to lose access to their wealth that they store in the West, and also to be able, to be received and welcomed in the West as they are now, if Russia launches a new invasion of Ukraine, and there are really severe costs, and they feel the impact of this new sanctions. So I hope these things are being discussed in the UK and in the West, like how to target Russian kleptocrats, how to target Russian money in the West, because I think that this is a leverage that the West has over Russia, which hasn't been used to the extent it could be used, and it's a very strong leverage.
So, thank you. James, your view, will the Russian military leadership just do as it's told by Putin, or, as we've seen in the past, they sometimes rebel against the political leadership?
Thank you very much for your question. First, it's important to understand at the general geopolitical, geostrategic level, there is a very tight commonality of outlook between Putin and the military establishment, the whole system. Now, at the same time, the Russian military are very good at going through a lessons learned process, and they keep doing this, and that's why I detect elements of greater realism about what they might be up against in Ukraine. And they're not hiding this from Putin. But if you look at the way the whole system works and is structured, and the psychology of the players involved, unless and until there is a demonstrable reverse attributed to Putin's policies, I don't think any of these people will be sticking their heads above the parapet. I'm quite confident of it. But look at what happened to Nikita Khrushchev after Cuba, where he went too far and he got into a situation he couldn't deal with, and there was a certain amount of face saving, but he had to basically climb down, and he was out of power fairly quickly. And you could see a lot of tensions and irritations before that, but it took that reverse to do it. So we're not there yet, are we?
But there is a clear, obviously, there's obviously a clear risk in things going wrong, and therefore that's a big gamble as well, isn't it, for Putin if he wants to keep his military on side?
Yeah, I think if he has gone too far, and possibly he has, the stakes for him personally are now much higher than they were at any point. He started all of this on a roll. They were all on a roll when all this was starting in 2021. Now I think the mood has become different precisely because of steps that have been taken. The very steps that a lot of people in Europe call provocative have introduce these elements of skepticism, of reservation, of enable us to have the discussion we are now having, make that discussion realistic. 2 years ago, this would not have been a realistic discussion to have, but, but it is now.
Okay. So can I just go on to a hybrid warfare? You can go back to 2014 and Crimea. Are we starting to see that to any great extent at the moment? Little green men starting to appear, special forces behind Ukrainian lines? Not to mention information and cyber warfare.
Well, as Olga said, you know, there are agents, there will be more, some have been caught, some have been exposed. You can't fool people, you can't fool many people twice. We've been through all this in 2014. We've all drawn conclusions, Ukrainians most of all. I don't see this happening, and I certainly don't see any possibility of it working. I think we are looking either at, I think it's going to be a very dangerous situation, however it plays out. But I think we are now looking at overt massive force, or a very costly alternative. I don't know what that alternative will be, but the Green Men scenario is no longer the alternative.
Yeah, I agree they will not be using the Green Men because there is no element of surprise anymore. Like everybody is prepared now that something like this could happen, so there will be no element of surprise. One, and two, because actually Russia back in 2014 and in 2015 it realized it's not enough to have just this agents and locals, special forces dressed as locals to capture and hold even those parts of Donbass. They did, because Ukrainian army in 2014, in the summer of 2014, was pushing back and was actually reconquering some of the cities captured by Russians, like Slovyansk. And what Russia had to do, it had to send its conventional military to, and you know, the Battle of Debaltseve. What they did, the Russian conventional military had to interfere to support the forces that were already there to recapture this territory, because otherwise they were not able to stop the Ukrainian army advance. And we are talking about 2014, when the Ukrainian army was in dire straits.
Okay,
exactly.
We're going to have to hold you there. We've got a vote coming up at 4 o'clock, and lots of questions. This is a fascinating discussion. I know that Kevin wants to come in here, and then over to David. Kevin Jones.
James, can I just ask you a question in terms of, you mentioned this early on, that if they did invade, this is not an easy invasion. I'm hearing that, yeah. What assessment do you think we take in the Russian military in terms of the economic cost to Russia, not just in terms of sanctions, but actually just the capacity to actually keep large numbers of troops stationed within within the borders of Ukraine?
In practical terms, I don't think that is a constraint. The cost to Russia in terms of their economy, their defense system, and the way it works are a mere fraction of what it would require from any NATO allies. So all these GDP comparisons don't mean anything. Even their contract soldiers are paid a pittance and don't even begin to have the kind of allowances and all the rest of it that NATO volunteer forces have. Even running a conscription system for us is vastly more expensive than the system they are running, the costs they pay for weapon systems, all of this. Their whole system works differently from ours. Of course, it's an economic burden. And of course, there are constraints, but they are bearable. And and at the same time, Putin has created a mobilization and in many ways militarized state that is designed to concentrate the limited power they have on doing these high priority things. And up to now, they've been doing this very cleverly, very resourcefully, and very well. So I don't think that's where the main vulnerability lies at this point.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Putin doesn't really care about how much money this will cost. Also because, well, the Russian population in general, it doesn't have a very high standard of living if you go outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg. And, Russian propaganda has been there for so many years, talking about the external threats and the West of NATO. And of course, dehumanizing Ukrainians, describing them as fascists, as a threat, as I said, a question that should be solved in expressions really reminiscent of Nazi Goebbels propaganda. Well, the head of Russian delegation at the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe, Pyotr Tolstoy, said that Ukrainian leaders should be hanged from the lampposts. And this is a rhetoric about Ukraine that is being broadcast every day on Russian state TV, that is being also maybe in a more subtle manner. This information is also targeting the Western audiences in those countries of the West that are more vulnerable to Russian malign influence, such as Italy, Germany. And I have to say a thing or two about Italy, where actually tomorrow President Putin will be speaking with Italian business circles. And that's another aspect, how Russia is trying to undermine the support of the West, because when it realizes it cannot achieve its objectives in speaking to political leaders, it uses the business context and the business connections with the enterprises in the European countries, in the Western countries, to try to pressure the governments via these businesses. So that's remarkable, actually, that Putin is speaking tomorrow with the representatives of the most important Italian industries. I think we should follow what he says there, whether they will be speaking about Ukraine. Of course, the topic is on economic relations and everything, but I'm sure that the pressure will be made on Italy to abstain from supporting the joint US and EU position on Ukraine. That's another matter, but I think it's important.
Thank you.
David. I just want to come back to the honourable member who asked me this question. If Putin can say at the end, I was the person who reversed this Ukrainian deviation, this heresy, and I brought Ukraine back to the motherland, then all these sacrifices, all these costs don't mean anything. And that's what he understands. And he'll be right in making that calculation.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Thank you both. How this pans out, obviously, it remains to be seen. But given that, it might be a case of there's some small measure of success for Putin or success for the West, or it will be a face-saving exercise or some exit that's allowed to prevail. What is both of your assessments of the likelihood, whatever the outcome, of this spilling over into other elements of Russia's western frontier with NATO, particularly in terms of our NATO allies in the Baltics?
Well, I'm sitting here in Estonia, and again, I said something about this at the beginning. If they are able to maintain a group of forces in Belarus, even if something is worked out in some way over Ukraine, we face a problem we haven't faced until now, and it's going to put our NATO collective deterrence and defense system under pressure, and this is going to have to be addressed. The Russians will have the capacity, however this turns out, to maintain a level of military tension in the entire area, from the Black Sea, from Bulgaria all the way to the Gulf of Finland. And the Finns themselves are aware of it, and the Swedes are aware of it. Going into the, at least the mid-term. So, there is a very strong connection here. The notion that you can just remove Ukraine and all these problems from the equation and preserve the strength of the rest of us, the security of the rest of it doesn't work. No. There are too many of these interconnections.
Yeah, I think there is a big risk that the war, like the full-scale war, if Russia decides to launch it on Ukraine, could really could spill over outside of Ukraine's borders. Baltic countries are potential next targets, but also the countries of the Black Sea region are worried. The countries of the Central and Eastern Europe are worried, and I think what is a bigger threat here is that. It will most probably lead to big cracks within the the international structures that exist now in NATO and in the European Union, because we already see these shifts and we already see these divisions. If you look at the list of the countries that are committed and said they are ready to provide Ukraine with defense assistance, these are the Baltic states, this is Czech Republic, this is the UK. But no Western European countries. And if an attack on Ukraine happens, the Central and Eastern European countries and the Baltics will feel again that they have been betrayed by the Western countries, and this will ultimately undermine the stability of the Euro-Atlantic institutions and might lead to really unpredictable consequences.
Okay. James, can I ask you, thank you, can I ask you, you referred earlier, you created a scenario whereby you sort of detailed Putin as having almost painted himself into a corner through an element of miscalculation on his part, and now he's got a problem that he has to get out of somehow. Am I characterising your comments accurately?
I think there are elements of this that are very, very strong now that weren't present at the beginning. I'll put it that way. I don't think they're in a stage. I don't think they're in a state of desperation yet. No. Okay, but as
but this isn't panning out the way that perhaps he had hoped a month or two ago.
I don't think it has. I mean, I emphasize that I think since this started, the dynamic, the responses have not been what he expected. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I refer to another expert, Michael Kaufman, who I have my disagreements with him, but I respect him very, very highly. And he rightly said some time ago, and we are fully in agreement, you don't want the Russians to be in a position where they feel either desperate or emboldened. Mm-hmm. And you're getting closer to that point where these scissors are closing, and that's why this remains a very dangerous situation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Chair.
Good. Moving on to Richard again.
James, you just said there that you thought the Russians did not expect the reaction from the West that has occurred. I think that's just what you said. If we look at the reaction from the West, the UK is giving a very strong one. Germany is being criticised for being incredibly weak, and other countries have muttered various things. I just wondered, do you think that the response in the West is going to be hamstrung by all the sort of internal wranglings that you're seeing, because I'm assuming you agree that unity is strength. The whole point of NATO was to act as one. Sadly, Ukraine's not in NATO, but certainly to act as one to deter aggression from a country like Russia.
That's a very important question, but I think it enables me to say that for the Russians, the country that really matters more than any is the United States. They're always very outraged by our pluck and defiance in the UK, but they tend to explain this away as us basically being the sort of reconnaissance battalion of the Americans. They're obsessed with the United States. It's the weakness they saw for a whole series of reasons in the Biden administration, beginning, I would say, as early as February last year, the missteps that led them to think they could push the Americans and then much of the West as a whole into doing all this. And the reaction I have been describing from the Biden administration, which is different, has only started, in my perception, relatively recently. It could still go the other way, because there's an argument inside Washington, there always is. And if the promising vector that has developed is now abandoned, and we start again equivocating and looking for compromises that aren't there, and telegraphing an absence of resolution on our part, then the Russians will swiftly feel emboldened again. So it's very much in the balance. This is why I said we're not there yet, because the encouraging developments we've seen have occurred only recently. And you mentioned, of course, the Franco-German factor and the syndromes in both France and Germany are deep, and they're very, very different. But it was quite interesting, wasn't it, to see the reaction elsewhere in Europe in response to President Macron's speech in the European Parliament. And then his immediate response included a statement that France is now willing to send troops to Romania. Well, splendid, but you have to ask what is going on there. Now, here is the devil's question. What is better? A low common denominator transatlantic consensus, which is ineffective, or an effective coalition of the willing that is doing things, led by the United States, which is the one country they really care about, that is doing the very things that worry them? James, I mean, I have my answer. It's probably obvious to you. My concern is the Biden administration will default to one of its dogmas, which is that transatlantic consensus, meaning consensus with the Germans, is more important than anything else. And if they do that, then I think we're on a losing wicket.
James, would you like to see, now, the United States have put 8,000 troops on standby. Are you insinuating that what you would have liked to have seen is NATO put tens of thousands of troops within NATO's borders on standby, not just 8,000, to say to Russia, we're here. And not that we mean business, we're going to have a major world war, we hope, but we are here to deter rather than just standing back and waiting for perhaps what is the inevitable. Is that what you would like NATO to have done?
The numbers are less important than the change in the dynamic, than the decision and the articulation of the decision to reinforce the eastern flank of NATO, and the articulation of the threat that we will reinforce it considerably more and change it if anything were to happen. The administration in Washington until recently was unwilling to consider any responses at all, apart from economic and financial sanctions. So this is a step change, and that matters more than whether it's 8,500 now or 10,000 now. I still think, by the way, and the point also applies to our own government, It is always a mistake, particularly in dealing with a very dangerous adversary at a point of crisis, to tell a dangerous adversary what you will not do. I understand why there are reasons for us to conclude it would not be a good idea for us to put British armed forces or American armed forces in harm's way in Ukraine itself. You don't announce this because this gives Putin an absolute green light, and it removes from the equation all manner of other military responses that are essential, that don't involve ground forces on the ground in Ukraine, beginning with cyber intelligence special forces, reinforcement of troops where they are. Our traditional policy has been and must remain, we don't comment on the presence of special forces and we don't comment on their absence.
Olga, sorry,
and
I left you.
First thing also to say, may I just add very quickly, you don't say, because Ukraine is not a member of NATO, we will not defend it. There's nothing in the Washington Treaty that prohibits a NATO ally from going to the defense of somebody outside NATO. Kuwait was not a member of NATO, was it? You don't say these things.
Okay.
So, sorry, I will.
No, it's amazing stuff, but we've got to explore some other things. Richard.
Just Olga, sorry, go back to the question which I've slightly diverted from, which I apologise. That is the Western response hamstringing or leaving hamstrung the agreements with the West to try and deter Russia?
Can I just add to what James just said? I think that one of the major things that emboldened Putin actually after this spring build-up last year was the agreement reached in the summer of 2021 between the US and Germany on the Nord Stream 2. Putin got what he wanted. So by escalating at Ukraine's borders in the spring, he got a meeting with Biden and he got an agreement favorable for him on the Nord Stream 2, which in Ukraine was seen as a betrayal because this is a clearly geopolitical project that is pushed by Gazprom and by business interests in Germany that has absolutely no economic use, but it's a purely political and geopolitical project of Russian leverage over Ukraine and over Europe. So I think this was, I think that emboldened Putin and that forced him to push to more aggressive actions that he's resorting to now. And I absolutely agree with James that he says that maybe certain things should not be voiced because also they are taken badly in Ukraine. When we hear that here, well, nobody in Ukraine expects NATO boots on the ground. That's clear. But when we hear that said and emphasized for 1,000th time, it's somehow, it doesn't really boost our morale. And also I see signs coming from the Ukrainian government and the expert community that Ukraine in its diplomacy and in its dealing, with the other countries is now willing to focus more on multilateral formats than on the formats with EU or NATO level, because it sees there is no unity inside the EU, there is no unity inside NATO. So, for example, the format that is being discussed now and very much looked forward into is the trilateral format with the UK and Poland. And there is appetite in Ukraine to explore what are the possibilities of military cooperation in this format, and if it could be somehow taken seriously into consideration in the UK.
Olga, it's very kind. Chairman.
Right. Emma, too.
Thanks, Chair. Just to follow on from my colleague's question there, I think, James, you might have briefly touched on this before. Macron suggested that Europe needs its own dialogue with Russia separate from the United States. Do either of you feel there's any merit in that at all?
I know we're pressed for time, so my answer would be no.
Thought so.
And the big question is, the fatigue I always have, the reason I always sigh when the word dialogue is mentioned, is it's irrelevant. What are you going to say? It's the same thing with diplomacy. Diplomacy to achieve what? These are the important questions. Dialogue, negotiation, talking, all the rest of it. Yes, it should always be going on. It should be going on in war itself. But the issue is, to what end? Do we have a position? What is our objective? What is our view? These are the questions that need to be discussed, not whether we talk or we don't talk.
Okay. Olga?
Yeah, and the perception in Ukraine is that such initiatives as President Macron, well, first, it looks like it's a absolutely political decision because he's in the election year and he uses it for his to gain political points ahead of the elections. And the second thing, well, from Ukrainian perspective, it looks not very promising and dangerous, to have. There will be these trilateral negotiations at the level of advisors these days, I think tomorrow in Paris, between France, Ukraine and Russia. But France is not seen as a trusted ally here in Kyiv, so there is little trust that these negotiations can achieve something. And there is actually a preoccupation that France might be siding rather with Russia than with Ukraine. So from the Ukrainian perspective, these formats are not very desirable, but there are other formats that Ukraine sees as more desirable. And of course, it looks for more involvement in the negotiation process of the UK and of the United States, which it sees as really committed allies and partners.
Okay. Thanks both for that. Just obviously, we talked about it earlier that this is the second time in less than a year that Russia has caused military escalation on the border with Ukraine. If this immediate crisis is peacefully resolved, what steps can NATO take to prevent this happening again? And in particular, I'm curious what you both feel about how effective sanctions actually are. James, I can start with you again, if you want.
Well, you finally asked me a question that stumped me. I think it's a question of what kind of Russia we have. If we are still facing the same Russia, we are still going to be dealing with an adversary. The immediate danger will have receded. We will have to then see what that adversary concludes and what it decides to do. So at one level, we could relax our vigilance a bit, but we should not be going off dining out on this and saying, as we've done too often in the past, well, we won and they lost and this problem is over. No, Russia is going to be a problem. And even if we have a post-Putin Russia, which can be it could be better, it could be worse. Russia is going to be a problem because its whole history predisposes them to a different outlook, a different understanding of Europe, of European security, than that which we sometimes wrongly take for granted and that which we seek to uphold. So that's going to be difficult for us in a different sense, to maintain this kind of mature understanding and realistic understanding at a time when the emergency has passed, and not to default to another set of utopias about history ending and our problems being over and triumphalism and we won, they lost, is going to be extremely important if we reach that happy point.
And from the Ukrainian perspective, well, if we look into centuries of Ukraine's history and struggle for independence, well, what is happening now is not surprising because, well, Russia has been trying to subjugate Ukraine for centuries and it succeeded to a large extent. And still, there was a strong Ukrainian movement for independence and for sovereignty. And for 30 years, Ukraine has been independent, and the population of Ukraine is not willing to give it up without a fight. Unfortunately, one cannot choose geography, one cannot choose its neighbors. So Ukrainians have no other choice than to strengthen themselves, than to get ready to defend themselves, to live in this constant state of alert, a little bit like Israel does, with an aggressive neighbor just next door. And as for the efficiency of sanctions, I think sanctions work, and we see it from Russia's reactions also to now the statements that have been made in the West regarding possible new sanctions. The most nervous reactions from the Kremlin were coming to the threat that there might be some sanctions targeting directly Putin or people immediately close to him. And also there was a nervous reaction to the statement that the sanctions could be targeting Russian bank sector and the SWIFT system. So I think we should really listen to those signals to assess whether sanctions are working. And I think the fact that Russia is now trying to have dialogue with businesses in those countries that it sees as weak links, as vulnerable, it also indicates that sanctions work. And as I said before, there is still a lot of leverage that the West hasn't used so far against Russia.
That's helpful. Just in terms of sanctions, obviously since 2014, the US has had sanctions already on Russia, and I've read somewhere that Putin's got, billions in international reserves, so sanctions wouldn't hit him directly anyway, or those close to him. It would hit other people instead. I'm just curious, what will be different this time around any sanctions that are imposed to what's been in place in 2014, and how would that directly affect him in terms of all the wealth that he's amassed?
We are talking about sanctions that at some level are different. Certainly severing Russia from SWIFT would be a step change. The issue is whether we can feasibly do it. Can the United States do this without German cooperation? Is the UK, and the question was raised in the debate several times, willing at the cost of damaging reputations of prominent people in the UK to do a clean sweep of rotten money in the City of London and our own financial system? All these questions, and understanding, the Prime Minister said at one point, we want the maximum amount of sanctions that are not going to further damage our economies. I'm sorry, beyond what we already have, any further increase in any qualitative change in sanctions will hurt us as well. Because we're starting from a position of Russia already being highly integrated in a financial and economic global system. And that's the issue. And you look at the whole energy question as well. Energy prices we are paying for people who earn far less than my modest Estonian salary, and the impact this has on them, and expecting a democratically, elected governments to say, I'm sorry, for the next 2 or 3 years, going to have to reconcile yourself, maybe for a longer period of time, to paying 40% more than that. Is all this really going to happen? Well, I think for those reasons and others, the Kremlin is highly skeptical. And they also understand business is interested in what they call CPI, in themselves. Western businesses are not charitable institutions. They're not, in general, unpatriotic, but they have their responsibilities to shareholders and so on. If they're exposed and they suffer, this is a breaking factor on our own governments. So yes, I can envisage theoretically that we could do certain things in the financial and economic sphere that would be very crippling to Russia and to Putin and the establishments around him. But I question the feasibility of us doing it in a time scale that is needed to deter Russia now in this crisis. And this is, you put all this together, and it's one reason I've said you cannot deter Russia by economic and financial means alone. And that's where they are coming from, too.
So suppose
I would just add that there are various types of sanctions, and there was a list compiled by Alexei Navalny, the jailed Russian opposition leader, of 35 people, if I'm not mistaken, from Putin's inner circle, who have not been targeted yet by the sweeping Western sanctions. There are Russian propagandists, such as Margarita Simonyan, the editor-in-chief of RT, who is not on the Western sanctions list. So there is still a way to go. And of course, it requires political will, it requires courage, but millions of lives are at stake, and it to be taken into consideration and not forgotten. Although I understand that for many in the West, and the farther from Ukraine it is, the less awareness and the less realization of what danger we are really facing there is. But as I said at the beginning, I think that it's not just Ukraine's security and peace is at stake, it's the whole of Europe and potentially even global.
Okay, thanks both. So if we did get to the point where Russia does invade Ukraine, how should NATO be responding to that?
by doing what we've said, by creating the very threats that Russia claims that we are posing, by
coming good on our promises.
Yeah, doing everything to support a Ukrainian insurgency and such elements of the Ukrainian state and armed forces as exist in helping Ukraine consolidate itself, by turning this into the very long war the Russians fear, a war that's not going to end, by a substantial change in our redeployments and our military capabilities in Central and Eastern Europe. And by sanctions as well. I mean, I would love to implement all the recommendations of the Intelligence and Security Committee of the House of Commons tomorrow, if I could, but the decision is not going to be made by me.
Thanks, Olga.
I agree that all options should be on the table. And actually, this week, the Czech Defense Ministry said that they would be ready to consider and to accept a formal request of Ukrainian government to send troops to Ukraine if Russia launches a new attack on Ukraine. So I think that should be on the table too. That shouldn't be excluded. It won't be a decision, a collective decision of NATO, but on a bilateral level, such decisions, I think, should be considered and should be taken.
Thank you both very much. I'll let someone else come in because I know we're pressed for time. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Just to explore that point, finally, it weaves into the next question, which I've got. I posed in the chamber, James, leading on from your point, that there's a threshold for which we can provide sanctions that will have any impact, given the differences in the West. We're now waking up to the sheer scale of the impact of Ukraine, of an invasion, which will ripple way beyond Ukraine itself. That's what we're seeing with security and economic consequences right across Europe, gas prices affected, rippling right to the UK, grain, which is something I didn't appreciate. Ukraine produces a phenomenal amount of grain which is exported to across Africa and Asia, would be interrupted too. All these things are pointing to Western governments now taking a far greater interest than this is a bit of Ukraine, somewhere else, I don't need to worry about it. With that all in mind, could we not cut to the chase here and prevent Russia from invading, causing all the knock-on consequences by actually advancing some NATO hardware into Ukraine before an invasion takes place? James.
I don't think we can do anything to prevent it. We can more effectively deter it and persuade the Russians that we mean what we say. It's not enough to say these things. We have to start doing them. It's not enough to talk deterrence. We have to do deterrence. Well, as I said, fortunately, some of these steps are being taken, the expedited weapons deliveries being just one. I myself would actually hope that there are American and some British special forces in Ukraine and Canadians as well. And we have to be seeing that we are willing to raise our game and we are willing to accept a level of risk that the Russians have accepted for some time. But these things don't prevent war. They give an adversary more reason not to start one. Nobody starts a war on the belief that he's going to lose it.
Okay, but the debate right now is, what do we do? If we can't do sanctions, can you advance, should it be dismissed? For example, a couple of senior generals, the US generals, did advocate the case that 15,000 NATO personnel able to call in extra assets if required, placed in Ukraine, would be enough for Putin to think twice about invasion. Rather than what we're doing at the moment is actually saying, don't invade, otherwise there will be consequences, knowing that there are limits on what we can actually do to retaliate after an invasion has taken place.
I think that is going to remain an armchair suggestion.
Yeah, I agree. I don't disagree with that.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Richard, did you want to come in?
James, very quick one. A full-scale invasion occurs. The most appalling bloodshed and loss of life happens, inevitably. The West, NATO, we sit and watch while it all happens?
Let me cite another parallel. In 1968, as you know, the Prague Spring was crushed in Czechoslovakia. And most people forget that at the same time, the Soviets were fully mobilized to go into Romania. At just that point, President Johnson gave a speech and he said to Brezhnev, "Do not unleash the dogs of war." Nobody asked him what he meant. No one asked him, does it mean troops, does it mean this, does it mean that? That diffused the Romanian crisis. I have felt, and I've said for a long time, that it would have been introduced a necessary element of clarity here had President Biden said, the United States will not agree to sit idly by and watch the Ukrainian state destroyed. And how can you not say that? If you say under no circumstances will we do X, Y, and Z, you're giving a green light, if necessary, to turning Kiev into a second Aleppo. And if we say then, oh, now we're going to do something, well, great. The point was to have prevented it happening in the first place.
Exactly. Okay, we're going to have to move on to two more final questions. Over to Gavin.
Thank you very much, Chair. Olga, perhaps I could ask you, if you don't mind, there's been an awful lot of talk about Ukraine between allies and Russia. It seems the only discussions that involved Ukraine themselves were held at the OSCE, and Russia has now dismissed that as a forum. Could I ask what your view is on Ukraine's direct involvement, should there be any future dialogue that involves or invokes issues around their own security?
You mean direct negotiations between Ukraine and Russia?
And at least they have a seat around the table, yeah.
Well, that's what President Zelensky suggested. He said several times that he was open to have a meeting with President Putin. But I think that's not a good idea for several reasons. First, Putin doesn't need it. He doesn't want it. He indicated he's not interested to talk with Ukraine because he doesn't see Ukraine as an agent in itself. It sees it, as deprived of sovereignty and agency, and he wants to negotiate with the big powers, with the US first of all. So Putin is not interested. And the second reason why this is not a good idea is, it's very unlikely that Zelensky will be able to outsmart and outplay the former KGB agent on a one-on-one meeting. So I think while all options should be tested, I think this is not the best way to go, and any negotiations with Russia should happen in presence of Ukraine's strongest allies. The Normandy format with Germany and France is virtually dead, and Russia has signaled it has no interest in engaging in it, although there are some attempts now by President Macron also to revive it, but I'm not sure they can succeed. Maybe another format, including the US, including the UK, could work better, but that's an open question. And I just wanted to add also to something James previously said, like what can deter, what can prevent a Russian new attack. I think what has been happening in the last week, like all the military assistance coming into Ukraine, that should continue. And that is something that could change Russia's calculus in terms of cost. And especially if something that has not yet been considered, such as missile defense to Ukraine, is taken into consideration and discussed. Well, some Ukrainian military experts, they say that these systems can be installed in Ukrainian territory temporarily, not for a long period of time, but temporarily in order to send a signal to Russia that because without the ability to have a superiority in air, Russia's options are more limited than they are now. So that's one option. And another option is to send some on a bilateral basis military personnel from the countries that support Ukraine to send them to Ukraine as instructors, as trainers, as consultants. There are already some of them, but there should be more.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to pass back to the chair now, James, if you don't mind, just because we're almost out of time.
So we are out of time, almost. We've got about a couple more minutes. The final question is just, you're aware of what Britain has contributed. I think that has been well received and that is appreciated. Is there anything more immediately, given where we are today, that you'd like to see the United Kingdom do? James?
Again, I don't think the warnings about, statements about what we will not do are positive. But if you look at what has been done, we've revived our reputation of being a country that punches above its weight. Sadly, the truly significant actor here is the United States. So what matters is not just from the UK, but from the Baltic states, from Poland, from other like-minded actors, the candor of that discussion now with the United States. And we shouldn't forget, it's going to be my last point, it has to be, the Cold War, the policies of containment and everything else, after the Second World War, they didn't start in the United States. They started in Europe. They were demanded by governments of the left in Europe, by the post-war British Labour Party, by socialists in France and Italy. They persuaded the Americans to change the wartime paradigm, and so we have a role in with the United States.
Okay, James, I'm sorry, you may not be aware. There's a division bell taking place there. Before we sign off publicly, can I, on behalf of the committee, say thank you to Olga and James. It really has been a fascinating session. This was going to be a one-off. We may decide to explore this a bit further, given how important this is. Very grateful for your contributions today. That brings to the close of this session. Thank you very much indeed. Order. Order.
Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Thank you very much.
That's great stuff. Fantastic. Thanks very much indeed, guys.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Stay safe, Olga.
And thanks to the UK for the support.
Thank you very much indeed.
Bye-bye. Are you coming?
Committee room.